A quiet entry. The airport was bustling with travelers rushing to catch their flights. Among the crowd, Marcus, a tall and well-built black soldier in uniform, quietly made his way toward the boarding gate. He had just returned from a long deployment overseas, and this was his first trip back home in months. His face showed a mix of exhaustion and relief. In his hand, Marcus held a first-class ticket. It wasn't something he usually experienced. He had saved up and treated himself to this one luxury. He felt proud of his decision. After all, he had earned it. The thought of sitting in a spacious seat and relaxing before finally reuniting with his family filled him with quiet joy. The boarding process began, and Marcus stepped into the line. People around him glanced at his uniform, some with admiration and others with indifference. Marcus wasn't expecting applause or praise. He was just doing his job. But he appreciated the occasional nods of respect from strangers. As Marcus entered the plane, he was greeted by the cheerful flight attendant at the door. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said with a warm smile, noticing his uniform. He nodded politely and made his way toward the first-class section. The cabin smelled of fresh leather seats and expensive cologne. Marcus scanned the numbers on the seats and finally spotted his. 2A. It was by the window. A small smile crossed his face as he thought about how comfortable a flight would be. However, as he approached his seat, a woman sitting nearby in the aisle seat of 2B turned to look at him. Her expression instantly changed. She frowned, her lips tightening as her eyes darted to his uniform and then back to his face. The woman, dressed in an elegant white blazer and pearls, tilted her head and said sharply, "Excuse me, but I think you are in the wrong section." Marcus paused, unsure if she was joking. Her tone was cold, and her words hung in the air like a challenge. "I'm sorry." Marcus replied politely, holding up his ticket. "This is my seat minus 2A. The woman, whose name tag on her carry-on bag read Karen, let out a laugh that didn't sound friendly. No, that can't be right," she said, shaking her head. "First class is for people who actually belong here. Maybe you should check with the flight attendant." Marcus's smile faded, but he remained calm. He had dealt with people like this before, people who judged him by his appearance rather than his character. "I'm sure this is my seat," he said, showing her his ticket again. Karen didn't even glance at the ticket. She crossed her arms and leaned back in her seat, blocking the way. "I don't think so," she said smugly. Nearby passengers began to notice the exchange. Some looked away, uncomfortable, while others pretended not to hear. A few whispered to each other, wondering what was happening. Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of the stares around him. He could have raised his voice or made a scene, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried again. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause any trouble. This is my seat. Please let me sit down." Karen rolled her eyes. "You must have made a mistake. People don't just get to walk into first class because they're wearing a uniform." Her words were sharp, almost dripping with disdain. Behind Karen, a man sitting in row 3C had been watching everything. His name was James, and he appeared to be in his late 40s, with silver streaks in his hair and a quiet but observant demeanor. James leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched Karen's behavior. He didn't say anything yet, but the expression on his face showed that he wasn't impressed by what he was seeing. The flight attendant arrived, noticing the tension in the cabin. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, looking between Marcus and Karen. Karen quickly spoke up, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "Yes, everything is fine. This man is just confused about his seat. I told him this is first class." Marcus sighed and handed his ticket to the flight attendant. "I'm in seat 2A, he said calmly. The flight attendant glanced at the ticket, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, this is indeed his seat," she said firmly. Karen's face turned red, but she didn't move. "Are you sure? I mean, are we really just letting anyone sit here these days?" She muttered under her breath, but loud enough for Marcus to hear. James, still sitting quietly behind them, pulled out his phone. He began recording the situation, his face unreadable. The flight attendant looked at Marcus apologetically. "Let me check with the pilot," she said, stepping away. Marcus stood there, his composure intact, but inside, he felt a mix of anger and sadness. He wondered why, even after serving his country, he still had to deal with moments like these. As Karen sat smugly in her seat, James leaned back, a small smirk forming on his face. He whispered to himself, "She has no idea who's watching." The story was far from over, and James seemed to have plans of his own. An awkward standoff. Marcus stood near his seat, trying to remain calm despite the humiliation he was feeling. Karen, still sitting in 2B, crossed her arms like a queen refusing to budge from her throne. Her smug expression made it clear that she had no intention of letting Marcus take his seat. The murmurs of other passengers grew louder. Some whispered among themselves, unsure if they should get involved. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said a word. The flight attendant returned after a brief conversation with the pilot. "Sir," she said to Marcus in a calm yet apologetic tone, "please give me just a moment to resolve this." Karen interrupted before Marcus could respond. "Finally, I told you he's in the wrong place," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "He should be back in coach, not here." Marcus clenched his jaw, but didn't respond to her insult. Instead, he gave the flight attendant a respectful nod. "Take your time," he said quietly. Behind them, James, the man in 3C, continued to observe the scene. His phone was still recording, capturing every word, every expression, and every condescending remark from Karen. James's sharp eyes darted between Marcus and Karen, as if piecing together a puzzle. "Unbelievable," James muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The man sitting next to him glanced over, curious but hesitant to ask what he was doing. The flight attendant returned, holding a printed manifest. "Ma'am," she said to Karen, her tone firm but polite, "this is his seat. He's listed as the passenger for 2A." Karen's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "There must be some mistake," she insisted. "I mean, look at him. Does he really seem like someone who would sit in first class?" The flight attendant's lips tightened, but she maintained her professionalism. "Ma'am, the ticket is valid. Please allow him to sit." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Fine, but I hope this doesn't ruin the experience for the rest of us," she said, shifting in her seat but still not making enough room for Marcus to pass. The tension in the cabin was thick, and the passengers were now openly watching. A young woman in row 4D whispered to her friend, "Can you believe this? How can someone be so rude?" Another man in row 1 cleared his throat, as if about to say something, but hesitated and looked away. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to squeeze past Karen. Just as he did, she stuck out her arm, blocking his way again. "Wait, are we just going to ignore the possibility that he's lying? People do things like this all the time, you know," Karen said, her voice dripping with suspicion. The flight attendant's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need you to stop. Let him sit, or I'll have to involve security." Karen gasped as if she had been the one wronged. "Security? For what? I'm just trying to make sure everything is fair," she exclaimed, her voice rising. From behind, James finally spoke. His voice was calm but carried a certain weight. "Fair? You think this is about fairness?" Karen turned to look at him, startled. "Excuse me." James leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I've been watching you since he got here," he said, his tone steady. "You're not trying to make things fair. You're just being hateful." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked unsure of herself. Marcus, surprised by James's words, glanced back at him. James gave Marcus a small nod, as if to say, "I've got your back." Karen quickly recovered and snapped, You don't know me. Mind your own business. James smirked, holding up his phone. Oh, I know enough. And so will a lot of other people once they see this. The color drained from Karen's face as she realized she was being recorded. You can't do that. That's an invasion of privacy, she stammered. James raised an eyebrow. Privacy? You didn't seem too concerned about privacy when you were humiliating this man in front of the whole plane. The passengers around them murmured in agreement, and a few even nodded at James's words. Karen shrank back into her seat, suddenly quiet. The flight attendant seized the moment. Ma'am, if you don't let him take his seat, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight. Karen reluctantly moved, grumbling under her breath. Marcus finally sat down, but the atmosphere was still tense. He nodded politely to the flight attendant and gave James a brief but grateful glance. James leaned back in his seat, satisfied but not done. He continued recording, as if waiting for the right moment to take further action. Karen, now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted in her seat. She didn't know it yet, but her day was about to get much worse. The message. The plane lifted off the ground, leaving the city lights behind as it climbed into the night sky. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, staring out the window. His reflection on the glass revealed the weariness on his face, but his posture remained composed. He wasn't the type to let an incident like this break his spirit. He'd faced far greater challenges before. Karen, on the other hand, was fidgeting restlessly. She kept glancing at Marcus and then behind her, where James sat. Her smug attitude from earlier had shifted into nervousness. The realization that she'd been recorded was clearly gnawing at her. James, calm and focused, tapped away on his phone. He wasn't scrolling mindlessly. He was sending the video to someone important. A journalist friend, perhaps, or maybe someone with a large following online. Either way, his intention was clear. Karen's behavior wouldn't go unnoticed. As the plane leveled out, the flight attendants began moving through the cabin with drinks and snacks. Marcus politely declined, wanting nothing more than to rest after the long ordeal. But his mind couldn't fully relax. The words Karen had thrown at him still echoed in his head. Does he really seem like someone who would sit in first class? Behind him, James finished typing a message. It read, "Caught something unbelievable on my flight. Sending the video now. Let me know if we should post this. People need to see it." He attached the clip and sent it to a contact labeled R. Hayes Media. Then he leaned back in his seat, a satisfied look on his face. Karen noticed James's smirk and couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned over the armrest and hissed, "What are you doing with that video? You have no right to record me." James didn't even flinch. He looked at her with an icy calm. "Oh, I'm just making sure your words don't disappear into thin air," he replied. Karen's face turned red. "You can't just spread lies about me," she snapped, her voice rising. "Lies?" James raised an eyebrow. "The camera doesn't lie, ma'am. You did that all by yourself." The passengers in nearby rows couldn't help but notice the exchange. A few whispered to each other, while others shot disapproving looks at Karen. Marcus, overhearing the commotion, turned his head slightly. He had no idea what James was up to, but he could sense that Karen was unraveling. The flight attendant approached again, her face a mixture of patience and concern. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice down," she said firmly. Karen huffed and sank back into her seat, glaring daggers at James. The tension in the cabin settled for a moment, but Karen wasn't done. She leaned closer to James and whispered, "You're going to regret this. I have connections, you know. People who can make this go away." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Do you now? That's funny. Because I know people too. The kind who care about the truth." Karen stiffened, her confidence faltering. Meanwhile, Marcus tried to focus on the small television screen in front of him. A part of him wanted to forget the entire incident, but another part wondered if this would have any consequences for Karen, for James, or even for himself. Suddenly, James's phone buzzed. He picked it up and read the reply. "This is big. Let's talk once you land. This story will hit hard." James smiled. He knew Karen wouldn't be able to talk her way out of this one. Karen, catching sight of his grin, felt a pit forming in her stomach. She didn't know who James was or what his connections were, but she could tell he wasn't bluffing. As the plane flew through the night, the air around them remained heavy with unspoken tension. Karen's world of control and privilege was beginning to crack, and she was starting to realize that she might not be able to stop it. Look, who is James working with, and how will Karen react once she learns the full extent of his plans? Will Marcus get pulled into this unfolding drama, or will he finally get the peace he deserves? The passengers around them murmured in agreement, and a few even nodded at James's words. Karen shrank back into her seat, suddenly quiet. The flight attendant seized the moment. "Ma'am, if you don't let him take his seat, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." Karen reluctantly moved, grumbling under her breath. Marcus finally sat down, but the atmosphere was still tense. He nodded politely to the flight attendant and gave James a brief but grateful glance. James leaned back in his seat, satisfied but not done. He continued recording, as if waiting for the right moment to take further action. Karen, now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted in her seat. She didn't know it yet, but her day was about to get much worse. The message. The plane lifted off the ground, leaving the city lights behind as it climbed into the night sky. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, staring out the window. His reflection on the glass revealed the weariness on his face, but his posture remained composed. He wasn't the type to let an incident like this break his spirit. He'd faced far greater challenges before. Karen, on the other hand, was fidgeting restlessly. She kept glancing at Marcus, and then behind her, where James sat. Her smug attitude from earlier had shifted into nervousness. The realization that she'd been recorded was clearly gnawing at her. James, calm and focused, tapped away on his phone. He wasn't scrolling mindlessly. He was sending the video to someone important. The journalist friend, perhaps, or maybe someone with a large following online. Either way, his intention was clear. Karen's behavior wouldn't go unnoticed. As the plane leveled out, the flight attendants began moving through the cabin with drinks and snacks. Marcus politely declined, wanting nothing more than to rest after the long ordeal. But his mind couldn't fully relax. The words Karen had thrown at him still echoed in his head. Does he really seem like someone who would sit in first class? Behind him, James finished typing a message. It read, "Caught something unbelievable on my flight. Sending the video now. Let me know if we should post this. People need to see it." He attached the clip and sent it to a contact labeled R. Hayes Media. Then he leaned back in his seat, a satisfied look on his face. Karen noticed James's smirk and couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned over the armrest and hissed, "What are you doing with that video? You have no right to record me." James didn't even flinch. He looked at her with an icy calm. "Oh, I'm just making sure your words don't disappear into thin air," he replied. Karen's face turned red. "You can't just spread lies about me," she snapped, her voice rising. "Lies?" James raised an eyebrow. "The camera doesn't lie, ma'am. You did that all by yourself." The passengers in nearby rows couldn't help but notice the exchange. A few whispered to each other, while others shot disapproving looks at Karen. Marcus, overhearing the commotion, turned his head slightly. He had no idea what James was up to, but he could sense that Karen was unraveling. The flight attendant approached again, her face a mixture of patience and concern. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice down," she said firmly. Karen huffed and sank back into her seat, glaring daggers at James. The tension in the cabin settled for a moment, but Karen wasn't done. She leaned closer to James and whispered, "You're going to regret this. I have connections, you know. People who can make this go away." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Do you now? That's funny, because I know people too. The kind who care about the truth." Karen stiffened, her confidence faltering. Meanwhile, Marcus tried to focus on the small television screen in front of him. A part of him wanted to forget the entire incident, but another part wondered if this would have any consequences for Karen, for James, or even for himself. Suddenly, James's phone buzzed. He picked it up and read the reply. "This is big. Let's talk once you land. This story will hit hard." James smiled. He knew Karen wouldn't be able to talk her way out of this one. Karen, catching sight of his grin, felt a pit forming in her stomach. She didn't know who James was or what his connections were, but she could tell he wasn't bluffing. As the plane flew through the night, the air around them remained heavy with unspoken tension. Karen's world of control and privilege was beginning to crack, and she was starting to realize that she might not be able to stop it. The storm brewing. As the plane soared through the night sky, the tension between the three passengers grew heavier with every passing minute. Marcus kept to himself, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Karen, now visibly agitated, was unable to sit still. She kept adjusting her scarf, tapping her fingers on the armrest, and glancing nervously at James. The confident, smug attitude she displayed earlier had vanished, replaced by unease and irritation. James, meanwhile, remained calm. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally typing something or glancing at Karen. His expression gave nothing away, but the occasional sly smile made it clear he was up to something. The flight attendants began serving dinner, breaking the awkward silence. Karen seized the opportunity to distract herself and called out to one of them with exaggerated politeness. "Excuse me, miss, I'd like a vegetarian meal. And can you make sure it's fresh? I can't eat anything subpar." The attendant nodded politely, but her professionalism couldn't hide the subtle hint of annoyance on her face. Karen's tone had rubbed her the wrong way. James chuckled softly, just loud enough for Karen to hear. She shot him a glare. "Is something funny?" she snapped. James met her gaze calmly. "Not at all," he said, leaning back in his seat, "just enjoying the show." Karen's cheeks flushed red, and she opened her mouth to retort, but a voice from behind cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a woman in row 4D said, leaning forward. "I couldn't help but notice earlier. You seemed upset about something." Karen turned, her expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you talking about?" The woman, in her mid-30s and dressed in a casual blazer, smiled politely. "Oh, just the way you treated that gentleman earlier," she said, nodding toward Marcus. "It seemed unnecessary." Karen bristled. "I don't see how that's any of your business," she said sharply. The woman didn't back down. "Maybe not," she said, her tone cool but firm. "But when someone acts out in public, it tends to become everyone's business." A few passengers chuckled softly at the remark. Karen's face grew even redder, and she quickly turned back in her seat, muttering under her breath. Marcus, hearing the exchange, turned slightly to glance at the woman. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. He nodded back in silent gratitude. Meanwhile, James was busy with his phone again. He tapped on the video he had recorded and uploaded it to a private folder. Then he sent another message to his contact. "I've locked the video. Let me know when you're ready to drop it." Karen noticed him typing and couldn't take it anymore. She leaned over the armrest and hissed, "Whatever you think you're doing, you'd better stop. You have no idea who you're dealing with." James smirked, not even bothering to look at her. "You keep saying that," he replied. "But from where I'm sitting, you're the one who's out of her depth." Karen's hands clenched into fists. She was losing control, and she hated it. "I'm warning you," she said in a low voice. "If you post that video, you'll regret it." James finally looked at her, his expression unbothered. "Oh, I don't think I will. But you might." Karen sank back into her seat, fuming but silent. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere in the cabin was electric. Passengers whispered to one another, some exchanging knowing looks, others sneaking glances at Marcus, Karen, or James. Marcus, trying to distance himself from the drama, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. But even he couldn't deny that something significant was unfolding around him. Karen's desperate move. The hum of the airplane engines was the only constant as tension continued to build in the cabin. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, her mind racing. She was no longer the confident woman who had denied Marcus his rightful seat. Now she was panicking, trying to think of a way to regain control. James, a few rows behind her, looked utterly at ease. His calm demeanor only fueled Karen's frustration. She had always prided herself on being in charge, but this situation was slipping further and further from her grasp. She glanced toward Marcus. He still hadn't said a word about what happened. He sat quietly, his eyes closed as if trying to block out the world. But Karen knew better. She knew he had heard everything, and the thought of him silently judging her was unbearable. Karen's fingers flew to her phone. She opened her contacts and found a familiar name: Richard Sterling. Richard was a high-profile attorney she'd once met at a charity gala. He owed her a favor, and she was determined to cash it in. She quickly typed out a message. "Urgent. I need your help. Someone is threatening me with a false video from my flight. Call me ASAP." Karen hit send and sighed, feeling a small sense of relief. If Richard stepped in, maybe she could stop James before he did something irreversible. Meanwhile, James noticed Karen typing furiously on her phone. He smirked but said nothing. His phone buzzed again with a reply from his media contact. "The video is perfect. Once we release it, it'll go viral. Let me know when you want to drop it." James leaned back in his seat, satisfied. Karen might think she could spin this to her advantage, but he was 2 steps ahead. As the flight attendants cleared away the dinner trays, Karen made her next move. She stood up, feigning calmness, and approached the flight attendant stationed near the galley. "Excuse me," Karen said, lowering her voice. "There's a man on this flight who's been behaving suspiciously. He's recording people without their consent and making threats." The flight attendant frowned. "Are you referring to a specific passenger, ma'am?" "Yes," Karen replied, glancing toward James. "He's sitting a few rows behind me. I feel very unsafe knowing he's filming people like that." The flight attendant nodded slowly. "I'll speak with him, ma'am. Thank you for letting us know." Karen returned to her seat, a triumphant smile on her face. But James, watching from his seat, noticed the exchange. He shook his head, amused by her desperate tactics. Moments later, the flight attendant approached James. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked politely. James looked up, unfazed. "Of course," he said, setting his phone down. Karen watched intently as the flight attendant leaned in to speak with James. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she imagined him squirming under the pressure. To her surprise, James remained calm. After a brief exchange, the flight attendant walked away, and James resumed typing on his phone, his expression as unbothered as ever. Karen's heart sank. Why isn't he worried? Why didn't the flight attendant do anything? Unbeknownst to her, James had shown the flight attendant the video, explaining exactly what had happened. The attendant had nodded in understanding and promised to report the matter to the airline upon landing. Karen's plan had backfired. Marcus, who had observed the interaction from the corner of his eye, felt a sense of justice creeping in. He didn't know James's full intentions, but it was clear the man wasn't backing down. As the plane cruised toward its destination, Karen's desperation grew. She wasn't used to losing, and the thought of James exposing her behavior to the world was unbearable. Landing into trouble. The plane began its descent, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival in just a few minutes. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly, and passengers adjusted their seatbelts, preparing for landing. Karen's anxiety was at an all-time high. Her phone buzzed, and she quickly glanced at it. A reply from Richard Sterling popped up. "I'll look into it. Call me as soon as you land." She felt a momentary sense of relief. At least someone powerful was on her side. But her victory felt hollow as she glanced at James, who remained cool, his phone in hand. He looked completely unbothered, as though he already knew how this would play out. Marcus, still seated quietly, opened his eyes and took a deep breath. He noticed Karen's restless movements and James's calm demeanor. Though he didn't know the full story, one thing was clear: justice was in motion, and Karen's carefully constructed world was starting to crack. As the plane touched down smoothly, a ripple of anticipation seemed to spread through the cabin. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and reaching for their luggage, but all eyes were subtly focused on Karen, James, and Marcus. Karen stood abruptly, grabbing her designer bag and phone. She glanced nervously at James, who remained seated, scrolling casually. Her mind raced. What is he planning? Is he going to confront me here? Or worse, post that video right now? As the plane taxied to the gate, James finally stood, stretching his legs and casually grabbing his backpack. He glanced at Marcus and nodded respectfully. Almost there, man, he said warmly. Marcus nodded back, appreciating the small gesture. He felt a strange sense of comfort from James, as though the younger man was silently standing up for him. Karen, unable to stand the suspense, leaned toward James as he passed by her seat. "You've made your point," she whispered harshly. "Now let's leave it at that. No need to escalate things further." James paused, turning to look at her with a calm but firm expression. "Leave it at that," he said, his voice low but clear. "You mean sweep it under the rug like it didn't happen?" "Sorry, but some lessons need to be learned." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but James walked away, heading toward the exit. Her face flushed with frustration and panic. As passengers began filing out of the plane, Karen stayed close behind James, hoping to intercept him before he could do anything drastic. But as they stepped into the terminal, her worst fear came true. Waiting near the gate was a small group of people, including a man holding a camera and a woman in a business suit. James walked straight toward them, smiling as he shook hands with the woman. Karen froze, her heart pounding. Who are these people? Reporters? Lawyers? The man with the camera turned toward James. "We're ready when you are," he said. James nodded, glancing at Karen out of the corner of his eye. "Perfect timing," he said. Karen's stomach dropped. She hurried toward the group, her voice rising. "Wait, you can't just." The woman in the suit held up a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, we're here to address a very serious incident. I suggest you step aside unless you'd like to make things worse for yourself." Karen's face turned pale. She looked around, noticing a growing number of passengers watching the scene unfold. Marcus, stepping off the plane, paused as he saw the commotion. He stayed back, unsure whether to get involved, but James noticed him and gave a reassuring nod. "This isn't over," Karen hissed, her voice shaking. James smiled calmly. "Oh, it's just beginning." Justice takes flight. The terminal was buzzing with energy as passengers filtered out of the gate. Karen's chest tightened as she realized she was standing in the center of a rapidly growing spectacle. More people were gathering, phones in hand, their eyes flickering between her and James. James stepped forward, calm as ever, as the man with the camera adjusted his equipment. The woman in the suit beside him spoke up, her voice confident and authoritative. "Before we proceed, I want to make it clear that we're here to ensure accountability and justice." Karen felt heat rising to her face. "Justice. This is a misunderstanding," she blurted, trying to control the situation. The woman raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? Let's let the footage speak for itself." James handed over his phone, and the camera operator connected it to a nearby tablet. Within seconds, the video of Karen denying Marcus his first-class seat and her condescending remarks were playing on the screen. Gasps echoed around the terminal as onlookers watched. Karen's stomach dropped. She reached out, trying to grab the device. "You can't show that. You don't have my permission." The woman in the suit stepped between her and the screen. Actually, ma'am, this was recorded in a public setting, and there's no expectation of privacy in such spaces. Your actions are on full display. Karen looked around, her eyes pleading with the passengers. This is out of context. He didn't say anything. He didn't even fight for his seat. A voice spoke up from behind her. Because he shouldn't have to. It was Marcus. He had quietly stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. For the first time, all eyes turned to him. I didn't say anything because I'm used to it. Marcus continued, his voice steady. People like you think they can act however they want without consequences. But this time, you're wrong. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several people nodded, their phones still recording the scene. Karen took a step back, her confidence unraveling. This is ridiculous. I was just trying to protect my seat. James cut her off, his voice sharp but measured. No, you were trying to protect your ego. You didn't see Marcus as a soldier, a human being, or someone who deserved respect. You saw him as less than you, and now the world gets to see that too. The woman in the suit addressed the crowd. The video will be released to the press shortly, along with a full account of what happened. This incident serves as a reminder that discrimination has no place anywhere, not on a plane, not in our society. Karen's face was ashen. She realized there was no escape, no one to manipulate into cleaning up her mess this time. As the group began to disperse, Marcus approached James and extended his hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. James shook his hand firmly. You deserve better, man. Just glad I could help. Karen watched as the two men walked away together, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by a few lingering passengers still whispering and shaking their heads. The video was posted later that day, quickly going viral. Comments poured in from around the world, praising Marcus for his dignity, and James for standing up for what was right. As for Karen, her life as she knew it was over. The backlash was immediate and relentless. Her employer issued a statement condemning her actions, and she was placed under investigation. For the first time in her life, Karen faced the consequences of her actions.